November 13th, 1942. Aero 148 hours, Ironbottom Sound, Guadalcanal. A searchlight tore open the tropical night as Captain Tamechi Hara clutched the bridge rail of destroyer Amatsukaze, staring in stunned disbelief while American salvos burst around his ship, steel and fire erupting like a volcano. They weren't taking careful aim. They were simply flooding the darkness with metal. Those hurried lines in his personal log captured a truth that settled the Pacific War's outcome before most Japanese officers grasped it. In the next 35 seconds, USS San Francisco would throw more 5-inch shells than some Japanese destroyers carried for an entire mission. The Americans weren't counting rounds. They built walls of fire that turned night into day, gun barrels glowing red from non-stop firing. 2,700 miles away at Pearl Harbor, ammunition ships were already taking on the next load, 15,000 tons of shells, enough to replace what the fleet would fire in this battle 50 times over. In Tokyo, planners argued whether they could allot 12 rounds per gun for the next convoy. The math of defeat was being stamped into brass and cordite, production figures mocking every Imperial Navy assumption about how to fight the United States. Hara would survive to become the only Japanese destroyer captain to fight from Pearl Harbor to the surrender, watching a transformation that shattered not just ships, but his service's worldview. The awakening had begun 6 months earlier, though few saw it. On May 7, 1942, at the Coral Sea, Commander Tetsuo Naito, executive officer on carrier Shokaku, noticed something that left him unsettled. American cruisers and destroyers kept their anti-aircraft guns going for 4 straight hours, never pausing to conserve ammo. Later, he told interrogators that each American destroyer seemed to carry more AA ammunition than our entire destroyer division. It sounded impossible. Japanese doctrine, refined over decades, assumed all navies faced similar limits. Japan's standard 25mm AA gun had strict rules. Hold fire until aircraft closed to 800 meters. Fire short 3 to 5 round bursts. Cease immediately once the target passed the sweet spot, not because this was best tactically, but because ammo stocks couldn't support anything else. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya aboard carrier Ryujo drilled his gunners on these rules. Every man knew the magazines held only about 12 minutes of sustained AA fire. After that, they were bare. The Americans, he noted with growing unease, seemed able to fire for hours, but the full meaning wouldn't hit home until Guadalcanal, where industrial arithmetic would be written in blood and steel across the waters the Americans would call Ironbottom Sound. February 27, 1942, the Java Sea. It should have been a straightforward Japanese victory, and tactically it was. Yet Captain Hara, commanding Amatsukaze, saw something that disturbed him more than enemy fire. The combined American, British, Dutch, Australian force under Rear Admiral Carroll Dorman shot off 1,919 8-inch shells and scored just 5 hits, 4 of them duds. The Japanese fired fewer rounds, but landed decisive blows. Still, Hara recorded a troubling detail in his after-action report. Allied ships never let up. They didn't seem concerned about burning through ammunition. Their rates of fire would have emptied Japanese magazines in the first hour. They shot as if ammunition were limitless, he later wrote in his memoir. Poor accuracy, yes, but so much supply that volume mattered more than precision. The Japanese victory was complete. 2 Allied cruisers and 3 destroyers sunk. Yet in the wardroom afterward, Hara overheard his gunnery officer doing sums. "Captain, we used 40% of our main battery ammo. 2 more hours and—" Hara cut him off, but the math was plain. A Matsukaze had sailed with 2,000 5-inch rounds. In one fight, they'd burned 800. Survivors said HMS Exeter alone had fired over 1,500 8-inch shells, more than most Japanese heavy cruisers carried in total. August 7, 1942, when the Americans landed on Guadalcanal, the Imperial Navy's response exposed the ammunition crisis in stark terms. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's striking force, racing south from Rabaul, carried enough ammo for exactly one night battle, not by design, but because that's all the magazines at Rabaul held. The August 9th action off Savo Island seemed to vindicate Japanese tactics. In 33 minutes, Mikawa's ships sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers, killing 1,007 sailors with no Japanese ships lost. Yet, inside this tactical masterpiece lay a strategic disaster. Commander Toshikazu Omi, Mikawa's operations officer, later admitted to American interrogators, "We withdrew not from fear of daylight air attack as you assumed, but because we had nearly shot ourselves empty. We had nothing left for a second round. The American transports, unarmed and loaded with supplies, were spared because the Japanese literally could not afford to shoot. Japanese forces had fired 471 shells total, scoring 10 hits, about a 2.1% rate Tokyo would later call wasteful." Meanwhile, at Pearl Harbor, Captain William Poco Smith supervised loading the ammunition ship USS Rainier. One voyage's manifest: 5,000 tons of naval ordnance, 350,000 5-inch shells, 1.2 million rounds of 40 mm and 3 million of 20 mm. More than the entire combined fleet would expend in the next 3 months. The Tokyo Express, high-speed destroyer runs to resupply Guadalcanal, showed the crisis in painful detail. On November 30, 1942, Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka led 8 destroyers on another dash. Captured documents revealed the cargo: rice, 100 drums, medical supplies, 200, ammunition, 280, for 15,000 starving soldiers, less than 300 drums of munitions. A single drum held roughly 300 rifle rounds or equivalent weight in other ordnance. The entire Japanese garrison was living on deliveries that one American destroyer could burn in 20 minutes of combat. Hara, running a Matsukaze on these trips, wrote bitterly, "We risk 8 destroyers and dozens of lives to bring what the Americans probably waste at the range." He wasn't exaggerating. That same day, destroyer USS Fletcher ran a routine gunnery shoot and expended 127 5-inch rounds, about half a drum of Tanaka's precious cargo. The numbers only widened the gap. Naval Ammunition Depot Hastings in Nebraska came online in March 1943. Spread across 48,000 acres with 2,200 buildings and 207 miles of track, it employed 10,000 people at peak. This single site made 40% of the Navy's ammunition in the war. In its first month, Hastings produced more naval ammo than all Japanese plants combined would make for the rest of 1943. Its specialty, 5-inch .38 shells, the backbone of American shipboard firepower, 100,000 per month at the start, rising to $300,000 by September 1943. Each round was inspected and test-fired. Quality control rejected more ammunition than Japanese factories produced. Naval Ammunition Depot McAllister, Oklahoma, opened alongside it, focused on larger shells and airdrop bombs. By December 1943, turning out monthly 16-inch, 50, 8-inch, 120, 5-inch 200, plus 500,000 pounds of aerial ordnance. Peak workforce, 8,600 in 1945. In Japan, the Kure Naval Arsenal struggled to produce 10,000 shells of all calibers monthly. Toyokawa Naval Arsenal, expanded at vast expense in 1940, reached a peak of 35,000 machine guns and 4.5 million rounds per month, only by employing 56,400 workers, including 6,000 conscripted school children aged 12 to 16 in dangerous jobs. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea showed the ammunition gulf at its widest. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa sailed 9 carriers with 473 aircraft, hoping for a decisive blow. Opposing him, Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded 15 carriers with 956 aircraft, and something Ozawa could not conceive, effectively bottomless ammunition. Lieutenant Sadamu Takahashi, a Zero pilot from Carrier Taiho, survived being shot down and later described his run-in with the American fleet. The sky turned black with bursts, not aimed shots, but a solid wall of explosions. They weren't targeting us. They were filling every cubic meter of air with steel. American 5-inch mounts kept up roughly 15 rounds per minute, 40mm guns at 120 per minute, 20mm cannons at 450 per minute. The destroyer USS Stockham alone fired about 12,000 rounds of 40mm and 20,000 of 20mm over 6 hours. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, observed from his Hellcat, "They flew into a curtain of fire. Our ships weren't picking off planes. They created kill zones nothing could cross. The arithmetic was merciless. Japan lost 476 aircraft, including those with sunken carriers. The U.S. lost 29. U.S. ammunition expended roughly 200,000 5-inch, 500,000 40mm, 1.2 million 20mm. Rescued Japanese pilots summed it up. This was not a battle, it was execution by machinery. October 25, 1944, 06:58 hours off Samar. The David and Goliath fight that would define the ammo war was about to begin. Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, surprised Taffy. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. What followed defied every expectation. Commander Ernest Evans of destroyer USS Johnston didn't blink. General quarters. Prepare to attack major fleet units. All engines flank. Left full rudder. In the next hour, Johnston would fire over 200 5-inch rounds at heavy cruiser Kumano, scoring around 40 hits that wrecked her superstructure, then dart at battleship Congo and fling another 30 rounds while making smoke. The gunners weren't aiming leisurely. They were pouring fire at maximum rate. On destroyer escort, USS Samuel B. Roberts, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland made his call. "We're going in. Odds are hopeless. Survival is unlikely." He didn't add that his ship carried only 325 rounds per gun, one type of 625 total. In 35 minutes, Roberts's crew sent more than 600 rounds from a single mount, nearly 40% of the ship's entire stock, until the barrel glowed white. Gunner's mate third-class Paul H. Carr kept Mount 52 firing after power failed, hand-loading 6 more rounds before a catastrophic blast. He was found dying with a 5-inch shell still in his arms, trying to ram it home. Across the line, battleship Yamato, history's largest gun platform, fired her main battery at surface targets for the first and only time. She threw dozens of 18.1-inch shells, but most were armor-piercing rounds meant for battleships. Against thin-skinned escorts, they punched through without detonating. Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding Battleship Division 1, wrote that night, "The enemy destroyers charged through their own smoke, firing without pause. Such expenditure by such small ships defies calculation. The tally tells the tale. American ammunition fired about 20,000 rounds of all calibers. Japanese, roughly 3,000. American losses: 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort, 1 escort carrier. 3 Japanese heavy cruisers crippled by gunfire. Result: Kurita withdrew despite overwhelming strength. By late 1944, the production reality bordered on the unbelievable. The United States made 47 billion rounds of small arms ammo between 1941 and 1945, 41.4 billion of them rifle and pistol cartridges. Enough, one general quipped, for 10 shots per person on Earth. Monthly figures for November 1944: small arms, 3.5 billion, 5-inch shells, 1.2 million, 40 mm rounds, 8 million, 20 mm, 20 million, 16-inch shells, 10,000, 14-inch, 15,000, 8-inch, 40,000, 6-inch, 60,000. Japan, across all categories, managed approximately 15 million rounds for the entire war. The Crane Naval Ammunition Depot in Indiana alone covered 63,000 acres and employed 10,000 workers, with 2,000 magazines holding 400,000 tons, twice the entire Imperial Navy's ammunition reserve in December 1941. The human contrast was just as stark. Hastings housed workers in dorms, fed 15,000 meals a day, and offered bowling and movies. Children went to on-site schools. It was a self-contained city, built to make instruments of war. At Toyokawa, 12-year-old Akiko Sato filled shell cases on 12-hour shifts. In her memoir, she wrote, "We were always hungry. 1 rice ball for lunch. We worked until we dropped. Many classmates died in accidents. We might turn out 100 shells in our section in a day. The Americans could shoot that in a second." The shortage fed a vicious cycle that sped Japan's collapse. Training withered when every round had to be saved for combat. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading surviving ace, described the slide. New pilots in 1944 got 40-60 flight hours, down from 700 in 1941, and gunnery practice was worse, maybe 100 rounds total. Americans fired thousands. At NAS Pensacola, trainees averaged about 5,000 rounds in advanced fighter training, with practice ammo effectively unlimited. Those who shot poorly simply fired more until they improved. U.S. pilots kept 400 525 flight hours through the war. Ensign Koshi Ito, trained in late 1944, recalled, "I fired 3 times before combat, 10 rounds each, 30 rounds in all. In my first fight, the American in front of me probably fired 30 rounds in the first second. For Japanese AA gunners, it was worse. Doctrine held fire until 800 meters. Point blank for a plane at 300 namas me porte, because beyond that range, hit probability dropped under 0.5% and ammo couldn't be wasted." American gunners learned the opposite. Seaman First Class Robert Scott, a 20mm gunner on USS New Jersey, remembered, "We shot at everything. Towed sleeves, balloons, floating targets. I must have fired 50,000 rounds in training. The first time I saw a Japanese plane, muscle memory took over. I wasn't thinking about ammo. I just filled the space he had to fly through." Logistics sealed the difference. Service Squadron 10, the mobile supply fleet for Task Force 38, fielded 34 oilers, 11 escort carriers for replacement aircraft, 19 ammo ships, 16 refrigerated supply ships, 8 hospital ships, 12 fleet tugs, and 29 destroyer escorts. On July 24, 22, 1945, Task Group 30.8 conducted what was likely the largest single underway replenishment in history: 6,369 tons of ammunition, 379,157 barrels of fuel, 1,635 tons of provisions, 99 replacement aircraft, 421 personnel, more ammunition in one evolution than many Japanese naval bases held in total. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, the combined fleet's final commander-in-chief, admitted after the war, "We estimated American consumption by our limits. If we could afford 1,000 rounds, we assumed they might have 3,000. The reality, 100,000, was beyond imagination." April 6, 1945, Operation Tengo, the Yamato's death run, made the ammo disparity painfully clear. Yamato sailed with 1,170 rounds for her 9 18.1-inch guns, 130 per barrel, essentially a full load, plus 1,629 rounds for her 6.1-inch guns and $13,500 AA rounds. That was every suitable shell Japan could gather. Her secondaries carried only about 60% normal. Her AA guns had maybe 12 minutes of sustained fire. Captain Kosaku Aruga told his crew, "We have enough for one battle. There will be no resupply. Use every round well." On April 7th, 386 American aircraft attacked in waves. The first wave reported tremendous AA fire. By the third wave, it had eased. By the fifth, it came sporadically. Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida, one of the few survivors, described the end. The 25mm fell silent first, out of ammo. Then the 127mm. Finally, the main battery had nothing left. We were a 70,000-ton target, nothing more. Meanwhile, the American carriers had been topped off just 72 hours earlier. USS Essex alone received 500 tons of ammunition, roughly 400,000 rounds across calibers. And her air group spent around 200,000 50-caliber rounds attacking Yamato, knowing tomorrow's replenishment would replace it all. Material shortages hollowed Japan from within. By 1944, copper for shell casings ran so short that the government seized bronze temple bells, some from the 8th century, along with statues and household items. Between 1937 and 1945, Japan melted down about 45,000 Buddhist temple bells, roughly 90% of the nation's total. A typical 500 kg bell yielded enough brass for perhaps 2,000 small caliber cases. What a single American 40mm mount could fire in 16 minutes. Conditions in the arsenals collapsed. At Toyokawa, monthly accident rates reached 15% by 1945 as exhausted children handled explosives with little training. On August 7, 1945, a B-29 raid destroyed the plant, killing 427 workers, mostly teenagers. Compare that to Mary Roberts at Hastings, 8-hour shifts, 5 days a week, $120 an hour, hot meals, Friday movies. "We knew we were winning," she said, one shell at a time. Tactics shifted to fit the gap. Admiral Willis A. Lee, the Navy's master of surface gunnery, refined area saturation for night action. Don't wait for perfect solutions. Flood the zone with shells, so evasion is impossible. At Surigao Strait on October 25, 1944, that philosophy reached its peak. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's battle line fired 285 16-inch shells, 3,104 14-inch, and thousands of 8 and 6-inch rounds in 18 minutes. The Japanese battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, sailing light on ammunition to save weight, managed fewer than 100 rounds in reply before they were smashed. Lieutenant Commander Tokuno Horitaka, one of Yamashiro's few survivors, remembered, "Shells fell like rain, not aimed at us in particular. The whole strait exploded. We shot back into the dark, but for every round we sent, 50 came back." On the Japanese side, increasingly desperate measures followed. Special attack units, kamikaze, were the grim end point of ammunition poverty. When conventional weapons are too precious to spend, the weapon becomes the pilot himself. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi admitted privately, "We turn to body crashing because we lack ammunition. One plane, one life, stands in for hundreds of shells we do not have." American codebreakers reading Japanese signals saw the shortage plainly and planned around it. A December 1944 decrypt summarized combined fleet stocks: 16-inch, 15% of minimum, 14-inch, 22%, 8-inch, 18%, 5-inch, 31%, AA, all calibers critical. Admiral Chester Nimitz told his staff, "They're a boxer with no punch. keep swinging. U.S. operations increasingly forced Japanese ammo expenditure, feints, harassment runs, probing attacks, not to take ground, but to drain magazines. Commander Joseph Rochefort noted, "We could predict their operations by their ammo requisitions. When they asked for resupply, we knew they couldn't fight for at least 2 weeks. We owned the clock." Submarines deepened the crisis by destroying ammunition at sea. The totals were brutal. 147 Japanese ammunition ships sunk, roughly 500,000 tons of ordnance lost, more than half of all shipments destroyed. In January 1943, Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mush Morton and USS Wahoo sank the ammo ship Fukuei Maru. The blast was seen 40 miles away. That single ship carried more ammunition than Rabaul would receive in the next 3 months. Captain Tatsuoka Shimazaki, who led an ammunition convoy, described the futility. "We left Kure with 10,000 tons of shells for Rabaul, 4 ships. On arrival, 2 were sunk and 1 damaged. We delivered 2,000 tons. The submarines took the rest." The psychological toll on logisticians was crushing. Commander Yoshiro Tanaka, responsible for ammunition distribution in the Philippines, killed himself in October 1944 after failing to deliver critical stocks to Leyte. His final words, "I send empty ships to die. The Americans sink them full or empty. Our guns fall silent while theirs never stop." By war's end, production numbers said everything. U.S. naval ammunition, 1941-45, total rounds, all types, 47 billion, 41.4 billion rifle and pistol, total weight, 4.2 million tons. Peak month March 1945 with 3.5 billion rounds, 47 production facilities, peak employment, 486,000. Japan, 1941-45, total rounds, all calibers, roughly 15 million. Total weight about 200,000 tons. Peak month November 1942 with 400,000 rounds, 11 facilities. Peak employment 95,000, including conscripted children. The small arms quantity gap alone exceeded 3,100 to 1, and quality widened it. Proximity fuses, fielded by the U.S. in 1943, increased AA lethality by 300 to 600%. Japanese fuses, degraded by material shortages, failed about 30% of the time by 1945. The disparity reshaped minds in both navies. For Americans, endless ammunition bred absolute confidence. Seaman James Bradley on destroyer USS Laffey recalled, "We never worried about running out. Supply ships came every few days with mountains of shells. We joked we could shoot at seagulls and nobody would care. That confidence fueled aggression. Destroyers charged battleships, escorts attacked heavy cruisers, PT boats nipped at destroyers. David versus Goliath scenes were possible because David had unlimited stones. For Japanese sailors, the shift ran the other way." Lieutenant Kazuhiko Ono, gunnery officer on destroyer Isakaze, described the mental drag. Every shell demanded justification. You counted rounds like a miser counts coins. In battle, part of your brain always asked, "Can I afford this shot?" That hesitation killed. Some of the sharpest pain came from watching American excess. Commander Tamichi Fukuda, captured after his destroyer sank at Leyte, was sent to Pearl Harbor aboard USS New Jersey. He watched a training shoot where the battleship fired 400 rounds. "I wept," he later admitted, not from the shame of capture, but from understanding. They spent more in practice than we carried into combat. How do you fight such wealth? The ammunition war reflected deeper economics. America's 1944 GNP hit about $210 billion, more than 10 times Japan's $20 billion, but raw totals understate the difference in munitions capacity. U.S. ammo production consumed roughly copper, 450,000 tons per year, lead, 380,000, steel, 2.88 million, explosives 3.2 million. Japan's total national consumption, military and civilian combined, never exceeded copper 80,000, lead 25,000, steel 4 million, mostly shipbuilding, explosives 200,000. The U.S. made more copper for shell casings than Japan had for all electrical, industrial, and military needs combined. U.S. lead just for bullets exceeded Japan's total lead by 15 times. Quality compounded quantity. The proximity fuse, developed at Johns Hopkins APL, revolutionized AA fire. No direct hits required. Shells burst when radar sensed a target nearby. The program cost about $1 billion in 1940s dollars, 5% of Japan's 1944 GNP, third only to the Manhattan Project, $2 billion, and B-29 development, $3 billion. Manufacturing demanded precision beyond Japan's reach. Each fuse housed miniature vacuum tubes robust enough to survive 20,000 G when fired. By war's end, America had built 22 million proximity fuses. They first saw action on January 5, 1943, when USS Helena brought down a dive bomber with her second salvo. Effectiveness jumped 300–600%. Admiral Koshi Hasegawa, seeing them in 1945, said, "American shells explode by magic as they near our planes. Each burst perfectly placed. This isn't war, it's mathematics." Fire control told the same story. The American Mark 37 system, standard on destroyers, added gyro stabilization, automatic radar tracking, mechanical fire control computers, electric servo drives, and remote power control, allowing accurate fire in any weather, day or night, against maneuvering targets. Each system cost about $500,000, more than a Japanese destroyer squadron's annual ammunition budget. Japanese fire control stayed largely manual, optical range finders that failed in bad visibility. Captain Toshiro Miura put it bluntly, "We aimed by eye, they aimed by machine. We guessed, they calculated." Hey, every American shell rode mathematics we couldn't match. Survival figures followed. On April 16, 1945, destroyer USS Laffey endured 22 kamikaze attacks in 80 minutes and lived largely because her guns never fell silent. 345 5-inch shells, 11,000 rounds of 40mm putters, 20,000 of 20mm, 9 attackers confirmed down, and 4 damaged that crashed elsewhere. She took 4 bombs and 6 kamikazes, yet stayed afloat because most attacks were blunted by constant fire. Compare cruiser Yahagi, escorting Yamato, her AA ammo gone after 45 minutes. She could only twist and turn as American planes hit unopposed. 7 torpedoes and a dozen bombs later, she rolled over. Cruiser USS Helena's totals deserve mention too. From December 1941 to July 1943, she fired 10,639 rounds, 3,165-inch and 7,179 6-inch, across Pearl Harbor, the Guadalcanal night battles, and Kula Gulf, where she was lost. She earned the nickname Machine Gun Cruiser for a rate of fire so high, Japanese observers believed she had automatic 6-inch guns. Her tempo exceeded what Japanese doctrine thought possible. Hara's line, that Americans fired without thinking while Japanese counted every round, captured more than a tactical split. It revealed the war's nature, not a duel between equals temporarily up or down, but industrial civilization crushing pre-industrial ambition. Final tallies are overwhelming. American ammunition expended, 47 billion rounds total, 41.4 billion rifle pistol. Japan, about 15 million rounds, all types estimated. Ratio, roughly 3,100 to 1. And even that understates reality. American forces spent ammunition on training, test firing, and harassment. Japanese units hoarded rounds to the moment of decision. Americans shot to suppress, to intimidate, to dominate. Japanese shot only when effect was certain. When Emperor Hirohito announced surrender on August 15, 1945, he spoke of a new and most cruel bomb. Privately, leaders knew the atom only shortened a defeat already sealed. Admiral Somu Toyota admitted, "We could build ships without steel and fly planes without fuel, rhetoric, but we could not fight without ammunition." The Americans had practically infinite supply. We melted our grandfathers' temple bells for a few more shells. In Kure's ruins, workers found a final production report dated August 14, 1945. Daily output, 73 shells, mixed calibers. Workforce, 423, including 200 middle school students. Status, critical shortages of all materials. That same day, Hastings reported daily output, 45,000 shells, mixed calibers. Workforce, 5,800. Status, exceeding quota. Recommendation, reduce production in anticipation of war's end. The Pacific War's ammunition gap teaches a lesson bigger than any single campaign. Wars between industrial powers are not decided by courage or skill alone, though both matter, but by the ability to turn raw materials into delivered destruction. Hara lived to write his memoirs, unique among Japanese destroyer captains, and his final judgment was stark. We brought swords to a machine gun fight and wondered why we lost. The Americans didn't defeat our Navy, their factories did. Every shell they fired announced an industrial supremacy we could neither imagine nor match. The brass on the ocean floor tells the story. Each casing stamped with U.S. ordnance marks, each a unit of capacity that turned warfare from art into arithmetic. Americans could afford to fire without thinking, because thinking was unnecessary when supply was endless. Japan counted because every round was precious. An irreplaceable sliver of national wealth turned into a weapon. But wars aren't won by counting. They're won by those who don't need to count. Those who can fill the sky with steel and the sea with fire, turning industrial might into destruction without hesitation or limit. Behind every statistic stood people. Ensign Teo Matsui, on a 25mm mount aboard carrier Zuikaku, was issued 10 rounds for Cape Engano, the ship's final fight. He held fire through repeated attacks, waiting for a perfect shot that never came. Zuikaku went down with his rounds unfired. His mother later read his last letter. "I have 10 chances to protect our ship. I will make each one count." She never learned her son died without firing, paralyzed by the math of scarcity. Meanwhile, Seaman Robert Dixon, a 20mm gunner on USS Essex in the same battle, fired about 15,000 rounds. "Mom, you wouldn't believe how many bullets we shoot," he wrote home. "It's like fireworks that never end. Don't worry. We have so much ammunition, nothing can get through." Both served with equal courage. One counted rounds. The other counted victories. The difference was not character, but capacity. Not bravery, but brass. Not will, but the ability to turn national wealth into naval firepower. 80 years after Japan's surrender, the lesson still stands. Professionals study Hara's line not as a curiosity, but as an enduring truth. Wars between industrial powers are settled in factories before they're fought at sea or ashore. American shells fell like rain because American factories produced like storms. Japanese shells were precious because their factories produced like artisans. In the end, Captain Tamechi Hara's words serve as an epitaph for an empire that challenged industrial mathematics with spiritual resolve. The Americans used shells without thinking, while we counted every round. In that difference lay not just tactical disadvantage, but strategic impossibility. Not just military defeat, but a civilizational reckoning with the arithmetic of modern war. The guns are silent now, but in archives from Pearl Harbor to Yokosuka And in memoirs from Washington to Tokyo, the truth endures. The Pacific War wasn't decided by the courage of those who fired the shells, but by the capacity of those who made them. The Americans could afford to shoot without thinking. The Japanese could only afford to think without shooting. Between those realities lay the abyss that swallowed an empire's ambitions and reshaped the world's understanding of industrial war. The final verdict comes not from admirals or historians, but from the numbers: 47 billion to 15 million. In that ratio lies the true story, not of tactical wins and losses, but of an industrial colossus that produced more ammunition than the world had ever seen facing a nation that melted its temple bells to cast a few more shells. The Americans fired without thinking because they could. The Japanese counted every round because they had to. And in that difference, the war's outcome was written before the first shot.